Aloha Management 301, my name is Austin Aukerman. I will be addressing the question of must we cut CO2 emissions to save our environment, and I will be presenting the no argument. Some key terms pertaining to the ethics of eliminating carbon emissions begins first with the method of identification. So this term backcasting is outlined in Chapter 9 of the textbook, and this is a term coined by environmental research and consulting group, The Natural Step. Backcasting is a prediction model whereby one examines the future by predicting an optimal future and then theorizing the necessary steps to reach that future. After that, we have physical application. That physical application, in this sense, is sustainable development. And this is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising any ability of future generations to meet their own needs. After that, we have how it applies to the businesses, and that would be sustainable business practice, which is a model of business practice in which business activities meet the standards of sustainability. After that, we get into the actual ethical application of sustainable business practices. And here we have carbon offsetting. So carbon offsetting is compensation for carbon dioxide emissions of one action by the reduction of carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases by another action. So this really is just to say that corporations will emit carbon emissions in one sense, and then really take into account how on the other side of that they're going to reduce carbon emissions on the other side of the house. Finally, we get into the logistical application or how it works out financially for businesses to do this, and this is carbon credits. Carbon credits is the logistical and financial means which incentivize corporations to cut back on CO2 emissions by allowing them to produce carbon dioxide emissions at an additional cost. So what are CO2 emissions and why do they matter to us? As most of us know, carbon emissions result from burning of fossil fuels, and this has increased significantly since the early 1900s with the regular use of petroleum-powered vehicles and the industrialization of many countries across the globe. The economic effects of CO2 emissions, I wanted to note that a disparity arises between the research conducted by the US government and researchers from Stanford University as to the monetary damage that's actually caused by each metric ton of carbon dioxide emission. So the US government holds this figure at about $37 per ton in estimated economic damage, and Stanford University holds that this figure is around $220 per ton. So in my research, I found that very interesting, just that disparity exists in what the actual information and data is. And then we have the environmental effects of CO2 emissions, and most of us know, again, heat is trapped within the atmosphere, causing higher global temperatures and subsequent weather anomalies, which have additional economic consequences, such as flooding, tornadoes, hurricanes, things of that nature. We do know that CO2 emissions create economic and environmental issues over time, but there's also a high socioeconomic cost associated with drastically changing the way countries and corporations produce goods, food, and energy. So now we can discuss some of the ethical dilemmas associated with cutting CO2 emissions. To be clear, it's important to note that the long-term decision to focus our efforts towards sustainable and renewable energy is overall morally and ethically correct. However, we must analyze if the steps needed to reach this goal cross current ethical lines in a way which tips that scale. This is to say, are we putting ourselves ethically at a detriment for a long-term picture of what we think the future should look like? Some questions that we can ask ourselves here start with, can we tell society how to behave now on the basis of potential future events? Next, are we taking measures to support renewable energy which are inefficient but help us feel like we are making a difference? Some examples of this would be burning coal to create electricity. We're really just handing off the responsibility of carbon emissions to corporations. We're just further removed from those CO2 emissions. Next, things like clearing land for wind farms. creating CO2 emissions in the process by clearing trees and vegetation using machinery, and meanwhile, these trees and vegetation help us to remove CO2 from our atmosphere. Finally, are global leaders imposing limitations on poorer countries, which will be detrimental to their development, solely to quote unquote make a difference in the world? So our method of identification is the backcasting methodology. As outlined in Chapter 9, and also briefly touched on in the key term slide, the backcasting methodology really is just taking a look at the future, the ideal future, and then analyzing or assessing the steps needed to achieve that optimal future. Unfortunately, by backcasting, we are only able to assess that a sustainable future involves a reduction of CO2 emissions at some point in time. However, it does not help us to uncover the idea that we must first correct our infrastructure and industrial culture prior to attempting this reduction. Much of what we do currently in the United States and in other countries is to make a concerted effort to feel as though we are cutting CO2 emissions, while we truly hand those emissions over to corporations to emit on our behalf. This normalization of removing consumer emissions by adding to corporate emissions desensitizes society from the reality of their own carbon footprint. So this is to say that it would be a bad idea to begin taking drastic measures to eliminate carbon emissions while we don't have the infrastructure and we don't have the industrial culture. We could really put ourselves in a pinch by desensitizing society and allowing them to think that by handing over their carbon emissions to corporations, that the job is done and that we truly are reducing carbon emissions. When we analyze the physical application and the logistic or financial application of eliminating carbon emissions, we arrive at carbon offsetting and carbon credits. From an industrial setting, carbon offsetting compensates for carbon dioxide emissions of one action by the reduction of carbon dioxide or other greenhouse gases of another action. Corporations purchase carbon credits to account for their carbon emissions from year to year. This is the logistical and financial means for the government to begin moving corporations away from fossil fuels to renewable resources. The issue here really arises in the idea that the opportunity that a corporation has to emit carbon is directly correlated to their abundance or lack of monetary resources. And this is something that can be dangerous from an ethical standpoint. It adds another layer of imbalance of power to corporations based on what they have from a monetary standpoint. Because it's important to do so, I've kind of tallied out the pros and cons of carbon credits, and the list runs as follows. So the pros are that it can help to slow down global warming. There is an incentive for companies to invest in research and development that is in line with renewable energy sources. It does create sustainable development. There is supposedly fair distribution, or at least at a surface level, there's fair distribution of social costs related to greenhouse gas emissions, which we kind of just talked about a little bit. Companies really can improve their public image, which seems to me to be a little bit superficial, but that is something that is available. It does put pressure on industries to behave more eco-friendly. And so those are all the pros. The cons are prices will absolutely increase. There are higher administrative costs associated with drastically reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which correlates to lower company profits and some company bankruptcies, which then correlates to higher unemployment. And then, we don't actually know the effectiveness of carbon offsetting across all industries. We do in some areas, but we don't have all the data that we need to. Finally, carbon offsetting programs will have their own problems in relation to corporate transparency, efficiency, and social outlook. So that's just kind of to say that you really do kind of open up a whole entire other can of worms by diving into this without that infrastructure and without the industrial culture. Finally, we have what I believe to be one of the most important aspects for the no argument of cutting carbon emissions, which is that from a holistic standpoint, cutting carbon emissions is a group effort, a true world group effort. And what we've done as nations powers is kind of come in and told poorer or underdeveloped nations that they are unable to or not allowed to do things that we've been doing for at least 100 years. So we've had our opportunity as a nation to grow and become what we are today, and we're turning around and we're telling other third world countries, developing nations, some poorer countries, that they are not even allowed to have any type of semblance of what we've done for just over 100 years. So as outlined in an article published in 2021 by The Guardian, the G20 and UN have historically done a poor job of assisting poor nations in joining the efforts towards renewable energies. This is extremely important because the reduction of CO2 emissions is a global effort. Infrastructural changes raise the cost of goods at home. The U.S. sees higher taxes as a result of aid sent to help control CO2 emissions in countries who cannot afford to do so on their own. And so this isn't to say that that's not something we should be doing, but it is to note again that on top of all of the rising costs, natural inflation, implementing new technologies, so on and so forth, we now do have to, in a very real sense, help support other countries complete this mission of reducing CO2 emissions. So we cannot feasibly cut CO2 emissions globally without raising the cost of goods and taxes to an unsustainable level and imposing unnecessary burden on poor countries. And that, to me, kind of sums up, because it is so holistic, it kind of sums up the no argument for me. For these reasons, we do not need to cut CO2 emissions right now to save our environment. I'd like to thank you all so much for your time. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed.